Generic notes. I love generic notes. So when we were in training a while ago, somebody said, do you have notes for everything in your library? And we went, no, we don't have notes for everything in our library, but we have notes for a lot of things. So, marketable securities, property, plant, and equipment, long-term debt, things like that. There are notes for that. And a lot of those notes connect to working papers, which really makes Jazzit special. But if we don't have a note for a particular item and you just want to put in a quick one, then use the generic notes to do that. In our financial statements, I'm going to go down to the notes menu here and just click the drop down for categories. So you see here, there is generic and single column notes. There's generic 2-column notes. There's generic 3 to 5 column, and there's this generic 9-column note. Okay, so we're going to see those categories in just a moment, but before we get into that, I want to also show you that generic notes can be connected to the statement pages, okay? So we can connect these notes to the balance sheet, the income statement, the generic 9-column schedule, or the income schedules, okay? Now, in the 9-column statements, if you have just the current prior year totals on, you can also connect onto those as well, okay? So how do we do that? Well, what we're gonna do here is we're going to add a linked line. So let me just right-click anywhere on this row, and I'm going to insert a linked line. Now, normally, if we were just gonna connect to a map number, we'd hit the drop-down, connect on, away we go. But instead, what I'm gonna do is just click right in this field here. So where the link number goes, I'm gonna double-click on that. Now, this brings up a little reminder saying to me that remember that when you finish connecting to your generic note, just add the note reference on as well. And we'll do that by just double clicking on the end pound sign and connecting onto it. So we will do that as well. So I'm going to click OK. Now I have one generic note in here and it's my inventory note. So if I had more of them, they would be listed here. They would show the description that would go in, the current and prior year balance. Notice that it is the generic note 2A there as well. That's going to be useful when we go to connect the note reference. So I'm going to connect to that. So that brings in the description, the balance in the current year, the balance in the prior year. Now notice the line above, I had it linked directly to the trial balance. This is one of those lines that's on there all the time. So if I right click, I don't see the option to delete it. But we can disable any of these lines quickly, 999, and it's disabled. So now I have my inventory line there. So that was simple. I just want to be able to show more information in a note here, and I'm using a generic note to do it. Now, the only other thing we need to do here is just double click on this end pound, and a little window which just popped up on another screen, there it is, shows up here. Remember before it said generic note 2A on the right when we were doing that linkage? If we didn't remember that, we see inventories here as well, so that's good. I'm going to check that off. We're done. We are connected. So if this note was turned off, you'd have nothing up in our balance sheet. If these notes are sorted, it would just change the reference number automatically. If we double click on any of these details, the description, current year or prior year balance, we go directly to the note. Now, did you know that if you right click on the number, you can actually go back to the reference as well? So where it says note 6 here, that actually takes us back to the balance sheet as well. I mean, I can use the navigation tool, but any note that's referenced in the statements, you can right click in there and actually jump back to the reference. So this would be the current long-term debt. This would be the long-term portion. So that's kind of cool too. I'll show you the neat little tricks there. Okay, now in terms of the generic note categories, so what can we connect to? We can connect to all the generic 2-column notes. We can connect to, there's a tax note in the, I think it's the KT module, option 8, the government remittances payable and other income tax options, so you can link to that. The generic 3 to 5 column notes where they have a total this year, total last year, these notes we can connect to on any of those pages we had listed above. So there is quite a few options in terms of what can be connected and where can it be connected. All right, so the main categories of generic notes. Now what I thought I would do here is I would go to my notes page and let's just walk through it this way. So the generic and single column note category, I'm going to browse the category alternatives, which just opens that category up for us. Very nice. So we have a few notes here for odds and end items. These are just a heading with a paragraph. If I wanted to, I could give it a different title, reuse it, or if we don't like the wording in the firm, the administrator can come in here and edit any of this, of course. There's a note here for discontinued operations. Now this one here, first time adoption of ASPE or ASNPO. When you're in your financial statements and you set the report to transition year, you'll get a button that pops up. It's pulling this note into your statement as the first note automatically. So don't have to worry that it's here, because when you need it, there's going to be a button to pop up and tell you about it as well. Okay, what else is in here? Well, there's a few other just sample notes in here, and then we get into just blank notes with lines in here. Nice thing is, all of these notes, I'm going to unlock this. Administrators know these passwords, but generally you just pull the note in and work with it. But remember, you can insert lines. You have options to skip. There's all kinds of good options in here for these notes. And then at the very bottom, we start to get into notes with a single category. So no comparatives, just current year notes. These are just single areas where you can insert a subtotal into these if you want, all right? But it's just one section. At the very bottom, we have a multi-section single column note. So this KN51, or sorry, at the very bottom here, let me get all the way down. All right, so these are multi-section notes here where you can have either each section is a total in itself or there's a grand total at the bottom. You will be able to add and subtract to the grand total at the bottom as well, just by using the plus minus on the right of each of the section totals or subtotals, okay? So the next category we have is the generic 2-column notes. So let me just close this and say no. So I'm just going to choose that category right here, generic 2-column notes, and let's browse those alternatives. Okay, so at the very top of the generic 2-column notes, we have another loan type note. So we have a note for loans and notes receivable, long-term debt, callable debt, lease obligations. But if you need another one of these for whatever reason, there is one here, okay? Remember, you can connect to this note on the balance sheet as well. So this note is just connected to the trial balance or manual, and it has a 5-year repayment schedule at the bottom, which you can turn off if you close the folder. Now below that, we just get into generic notes. So these are 2-column with a paragraph above, paragraph below, and all of this. One thing to keep in mind here is that a lot of these buttons you used to see have been cleaned up. They're now under a menu here. So this notes control menu, you'll see a lot of these things like page break. And this is actually a very important thing we want to talk about today as well, is that every single note now has this page break above option. We no longer have any notes that are forced to keep together. This means that you now can completely control the flow of notes across pages. This became an issue with a note like description of business, which has a keep together on usually, became a long note and it was leaving blank space at the beginning or at the end of a previous page. Now, any note, right click in here, you can do a page break above on that particular note. No note has a keep together option on it now. So you completely control the flow of the notes, which I think is a pretty significant improvement. Okay, let me go back here and let me open this up. So down here at the bottom, you'll notice that we have a bunch of A through H or J. Then we get into these 3 R notes. These are multi-section notes. So you can turn on and off up to 12 sections. Each section could just be a total, or it can be a subtotal to a grand total. And then each of these sections can be added or subtracted to the bottom. The one thing we don't have in here is a running total. So if you need a running total, use the SC, I think it is 2, the generic 9-column has a running total option. It is not yet in here. We haven't had a request for that. Having said it, now we'll probably get a request for it, but there is a lot of flexibility in these notes for the generic 2-column. Now, the next one is the generic 3 to 5 column. So let me go back to the statements here. And I'm just going to open that category up so you can see what's in here. 3 to 5 column generic notes. Let's browse that column. Okay, so in here, a real ragtag of different kinds of notes. You see there's one here for an allocation of impairment loss. There's a stock option note in here. There's a generic 1 to 5 column, so you can set how many columns you want from 1 to 5. The second and third column can be added or subtracted from the first column. Then we have a total this year and a total last year. So these two columns would be what we would connect onto the statements. When the file rolls forward, the amount in the current year would roll into the prior year. We have a 3 or 4 column, so we can turn on and off these two columns, and a total this year. Notice there's no comparative in this one. A little more room for description in here. There's 3 of those. We had a request for another property, plant, and equipment note. So if you think about our default property, plant, equipment note, here's a generic version of it. What's different about this one is it does not connect to our property, plant, equipment working paper, so keep that in mind. The default one does. This one will connect either to the trial balance, or you can insert manual lines, but if you need another one, here it is. Now, the other thing that we got asked for, we have a detailed property, plant, equipment note, which you may be using on maybe an IFRS engagement. This one shows additions and disposals for the current and for the prior year. So there is an option to turn the prior year on. It shows amortization for the current and prior year. So there is a note for property, plant, equipment, which you can use. And if you need another one, in this case, we said right of use for leases, you could pull that in from this 3 to 5 column note category. Now this one here is an inventory note. What's nice about it here is you could say the number of units, or you could say the type of unit. So we could say boxes, cows, whatever we want, we can put in the description for the current and prior year. So that's what's different about this note versus say just a generic 2-column note. We have a multi-section 1 to 5 column note at the bottom here. So up to 5 columns and up to 5 sections. So that's kind of like a spreadsheet. And then at the very bottom, we have a note for sales, which breaks down the sales revenue, cost of sales, gross margin, and percent. And what's nice about these notes is on the very far right side, there's an entity drop down. So if you are using consolidation for funds or for divisions, in these generic notes, you could click on the entity and just show that particular entity. So for example, in this note, we could have Division 10, north side, Division 20, south side. We could be showing the revenue, cost of sales, dollar amount, percentage in one note here by using the entity function, which is really nice. Okay, now the last category under generic is this 9-column one. So if I just click here and I just click on the drop down, you'll see that is an option there, generic 9-column note. I'm not going to, well, I'll bring it. I just want to show you this here. So basically what it's saying is that if you bring this note in, it's like a spreadsheet. It's very much like the generic 9-column schedule, except it's a note. It has to be on its own page and it will appear at the end of the notes. So the only difference really between this and the schedule is that it's part of the notes rather than it being a schedule, okay? So I'm gonna actually escape that. And there we go. So there is our generic notes. Did I miss out anything on that, Lori?
I don't think so. I think you covered that pretty well. Okay. There's so much in generic notes, but they're so useful.
There's a lot there, and if you haven't really looked through those, take a look at them. You know, one other thing we talk about, which we're not going to talk about today, I think we've covered it in a previous Java, is the idea of putting objects in, like Excel objects. So if generic notes don't work, the next stage would be, I'm going to stick an Excel object in one of these generic notes, or a generic schedule, perhaps.